It's Connor Svensson here, founder and CEO at Web3 Labs. This is a conversation I had with Kieran James Lubin, President and CEO at BlockApps. Kieran's been involved in Web3 since its beginnings, having collaborated with a number of the early Ethereum team and starting BlockApps way back in 2015. During our conversation, we covered a lot of ground, including how they've seen the enterprise blockchain landscape evolve, where they're seeing a lot of success with projects in enterprise, and how public blockchains fit into this whole landscape. Given Kieran and BlockApps' focus during the past 7 years on enterprise Web3 technology, there are few people better qualified to discuss this specific area, and you'll no doubt take a lot away from our conversation. Hey Kieran, it's great to be speaking to you again here.
Great to be speaking with you as well.
So you're someone who's been working in Web3 and blockchain for a long time now in this relatively nascent industry, and BlockApps itself was founded in 2015, I believe. What was it? What was your own personal journey like in terms of how you went from learning about Web3 and the associated technologies to be involved in it day in, day out, and no doubt now that's focused on BlockApps, but I'd love to hear more about the steps that took you there.
Yeah, it came in a few waves, I suppose. So I first was aware of Bitcoin, I think it's either 2010 or 2011. I have a distinct memory of the price being $3. And if I had just, put a couple $100 into it then, actually we would probably still be having this conversation today. But, there's some real FOMO there. So at the time, so that, yeah, 2010, 2011, I didn't understand the uniqueness of the technology. I sort of thought of it as just sort of a new web native digital currency, and the decentralization aspect, I guess maybe I had some sense of what that was, but I didn't understand it at a technology level. And then, so I was in grad school. I started to look again at the technology. One, in the first sort of Mt. Gox related price run up. And then two, when the Ethereum white paper got circulated. The Ethereum white paper actually got me to go back and read the Bitcoin white paper. Then I just learned a lot more about how the technology fit together. So I was a mathematical physicist at UC Berkeley. And I'm sure that degree will never be finished, but, because all but dissertation, I passed my qualifying exam and everything. And so I was lucky enough to work on Ethereum kind of summer 2014 and got to know Vitalik pretty well. I guess having some of the academic language and the ability to analyze the protocol was helpful at that time. I also helped the Ethereum Foundation sort of interface with academia for a while. And we put on a conference, probably long forgotten now, but called Crypto Economicon at the time. This was early 2015. Had a lot of, obviously Vitalik, the Ethereum core devs were there. We had a few people who were Bitcoin core devs or core contributors show up. And, it's very nascent at the time, but there was a feel at that conference that you were there sort of for the beginnings of the internet somehow. And a lot of excitement, and a lot of the people there went on to found sort of foundational layer one protocols and or start companies in the space. So it was a mix for me of I guess like everyone, I was a little bit interested when the one of those first big price run ups happened, but also technical interest. Right, once I started to delve into the nitty gritty of the protocols. I was actually sort of quite excited about what a technical marvel Bitcoin and Ethereum and all others were.
And as a sort of scientist, straight technologist, first and foremost, what was it specifically about Ethereum that really captured your attention in that regard?
Yeah, I think so. Somehow my order was, I read the Ethereum white paper first, and then the Bitcoin white paper, and so in some sense that's the wrong order. It's the wrong order historically. But I think the idea that there would be so Bitcoin, for better for worse, in my mind, was pigeonholed as like a money thing, which I was interested in, but not, not especially. It was sort of not necessarily going to follow like a financial services path or anything of that nature. The idea that it could be sort of a general compute fabric, if you will, that would be, I guess, more controlled by the planet at large than other systems to date was, and I think this was what everyone was excited about. I think people were also just excited about like Vitalik personally. Like he has, and even then had a bit of a wunderkind cult of personality, and it's cool to get to know the guy. He's a very humble guy, and I think in the early days, just had no worry at all for his own like personal creature comforts. Still doesn't, I don't think. But yeah, I think so. In those days, the term color coins was thrown around a lot. Like people were making a lot of application specific blockchains that were pretty simple, but like one for trading some other type of asset, or Namecoin was interesting, and that you had to make a whole standalone blockchain to create a DNS like service. I assume Namecoin is still around, but it's interesting that we've gone through sort of a second wave of that as well, right? So like we have Ethereum, but and it's obviously the center of most developer activity. A lot of the sort of asset value in the space is on Ethereum in one way or another. But then you're seeing another wave of layer 2 technologies, but also net new layer 1s that are a little bit more application specific. So it seems like there's a cycle with that we were first aware of back then, and then it's kicked off again. But yeah, for better or for worse, it even much before it launched, it seemed to capture the mind share of developers in particular, and it sort of has served as the center of gravity for programmable blockchains, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely, and I could completely empathize with the programmable part of it, because Bitcoin was always like, yeah, it's a digital currency, or now digital gold, but that's kind of it, right? And just that programmability, the community, and everything else is just such a fun part of it. And so from there, I know that one of the earlier initiatives that Block Apps, I guess, started with. I don't know if this predates Block Apps in terms of the Strato client, or it was you started it alongside Block Apps, and of course it's still very much a core piece of your platform. But what was kind of the story there? Because you obviously got into Ethereum client development at some point in this journey.
Oh yeah, good question. So during that time, I was helping the Ethereum Foundation. I met one of my two co-founders, James Ramustiar, and he was living pretty close to me in the Bay Area. I was up in Berkeley. He was in Hayward, so it was like 40-minute drive. 35 minutes, no traffic. Now with traffic, it can be a good 90 minutes in the Bay Area for those who know. And he had founded. He also had his background was a little more physics, mine was a little more math, but sort of similar technical background. And he had founded a couple, basically security companies, one of which sold to Symantec. And sort of, he was kind of looking around for a project, and I got introduced to him by a contact I made in my sort of academic outreach related to Ethereum. And so we started to meet regularly, and he, with a little bit of my help, later more of my help, started to build out the Haskell Ethereum client. And the goal then was, it was more to understand the technology than to commercialize it. To be able to connect to the testnet, download it, run the transactions, all that sort of thing. And in the leading up to the launch, right, there was a lot of sort of shifting sand, if you will, with the protocol. You would just wake up one morning and the behavior of the other clients would just change, and you couldn't sync to them. You'd have to update something, and then it would sync again. And so that did form the basis of all the code we have today. Now we've sort of added a lot on top of the Ethereum protocol for enterprise use cases over the years. But we learned a lot in the early days from just actually creating a standalone implementation of the technology. And that helped both see all of the great benefits of the technology, but some of the shortcomings in the enterprise context as well.
And so that ultimately led to the creation of the company?
Yeah, I suppose so. So we were working together on that project, and also Jim had worked with our third co-founder, Victor Wong, in Victor's last company, which was some sort of mobile gaming company in China, and he'd been the CTO there for 18 months or so. And as Victor was separating from that company, they were sort of looking concurrently for a project to do. And Jim almost like offhandedly mentioned what he was doing in the blockchain space, and said, "Hey, I don't know if there's a business here." It was funny. This was sort of long before the sector was really hot. But maybe take a look at what we're doing, see if you think there's any commercial application. And sort of together, we sort of very early on had the idea to focus on, one, accessibility of the technology, but two, to be sort of an infrastructure player. We always used to say, who really benefited from the rise of the internet other than, the big web properties like Oracle, Cisco, that sort of company. So we decided to be a B2B player focused on the needs of businesses, and went in that direction very early on to as a guide for the technology, the company, sort of, et cetera. So in the first year, we went on to partner with Microsoft to create the blockchain as a service category. Not a great name. It sort of makes it sound more centralized, I suppose, than it is necessarily. But so we had kind of packaged our technology to be available on their cloud, got lots of our first users that way. And then sort of through those first few years, really were focused on commercializing the platform side and just, continuing to learn and iterate on what these folks needed. It took a while to get our privacy solution in place, but the number one objection we got, even with a permissioned blockchain for years, was, okay, yes, I can't use the public chains because I don't want a floating cryptocurrency. I just can't account for it on my balance sheet. And if I put transactions there, even if they're pseudonymous, they're on an open public ledger forever, basically. And so I can't put any of my proprietary business data on there. And first, we solved the permissioning, so knowing who everyone is on the network and being able to create a network that doesn't include the entire planet potentially. But we had to go further, actually, and isolate the data itself so that the enterprises could share it basically on a per counterparty basis, and not with the sort of entire world. And you're starting to see that appear to some extent with in some of the layer one public chains. You see it definitely, analogs of it, not as good, obviously, in some of the enterprise-focused blockchains as well. But that was one of our first big innovations, and it got a lot of our customers sort of over the hurdle of really using the technology. And so it was kind of a big moment for us, if you will, being able to roll that out. Also, so concurrent with all this activity, right, we helped to found the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which obviously you were quite active in. And basically it was because Ethereum still remains the preferred solution, and ours and different flavors of it, within big enterprises. Many of them started to try to modify it themselves to do basically what we described. So JP Morgan was active in doing that. We've done some work with them. And other groups were just sort of tinkering with the internals of Ethereum to try to achieve some form of transactional privacy and then all the other features that the enterprises needed to consume the technology. And so, it's a good sign, I suppose, when someone's trying to solve a problem for themselves that you can solve. And we saw then that there's real demand for this solution.
And so fast forwarding through a number of years to 2022, do you think that much has changed in terms of the enterprise blockchain landscape? And because we've been through a number of different cycles since that point, and I think from what I can see, your business is still, very, very much so focused on that area around these enterprise blockchain, private permission chains, and it's obviously thriving with that as well, given all of the different launches that you've had over the years too, which we'll come on to shortly. But yeah, I'd be interested to get your take there if much has changed from that kind of initial thesis that you had versus where we are today.
Yeah, I would say it's changed. It's not been a step function change. It's changed in degree, and there are different characters of the market, and the market's much bigger than it was, but more than a 0 to 1. So, I think large enterprises who can afford, a business like a, a digital innovation unit or something of that nature, have done a good handful of blockchain projects, most of them. And most of them went to large firms to help service those. So Big Four, Accenture, IBMs, et cetera. Plenty did do some work with startups. And I think by and large, there was a lot of good that came out of that, but they just didn't really know the adoption model. So I think enterprises at that time were trying to really apply existing analogies for how to use software. And of course, we were a company that was helping them do this. And to take the technology, and treat it like another data store, another ERP, another, et cetera, which it worked okay, right? But I think it limited the scaling potential of the usage of the technology in the enterprise, where let's say a big company could get a bunch of their key vendors on the system and a few of their big customers, but you didn't see, let's say in a supply chain setting, like a whole widely distributed network of parties all on one system, just simply because it was difficult for these companies to say, come join my blockchain. It's like, why join yours, et cetera. So I think what's really matured is the understanding on the customer side of kind of how to develop the sort of long-term funding, but also just the governance model for these blockchains. So we're involved with some consortia. We also see, people have stood up like industry-owned, quasi-market utilities, and we're seeing sort of that if you match the kind of corporate governance structure to sort of what the blockchain looks like, it tends to work better, especially in the B2B context. And I think people have figured that out. So it's the technology, of course, has matured quite a bit in this period of time. But it was the hardest thing to figure out is how to get a bunch of people to use it together who might be nominally competitors or real competitors on use cases that benefit them all, and to benefit from the scale of the technology and to some extent, the shared investment in it, right? And that process has matured quite a bit. There are groups that exist to help these big companies coordinate. They tend to more have an in-house competence than they used to. So in the old days, they sort of tried to outsource everything if they're going to build something net new, or just even the management of the blockchain, et cetera, which is still totally fine. But you can tell that they're committed in some ways when they have in-house resources. And so there's a growing number of folks who would have significant in-house blockchain competence at a big company. I'd also say we've sort of seen the use cases coalesce a little bit. So we can talk more about our application sort of solutions shortly, but we've basically seen certain areas where demand has concentrated. So if you've got a general purpose platform, you can catch lots of different use cases, and we've done so. But it's sort of a blessing and a curse, right? So we have where we've seen people really want a focused solution that's aimed more at the business side than IT, which is building its own solutions on the platform. We've gone and worked in those areas to build out a baked solution that the enterprise can just use. It has a user interface and all that sort of thing, kind of on day one. So it's been an interesting journey. I would also say sustainability has really come on in the last few years. And I'm fond of quoting this fact. So in 2011, I believe maybe 20% of the S&P 500 put out a sustainability report. And it's well over 90% now. There's just such sustained secular pressure to, on all companies, big ones especially, to have a sustainability posture and to really sort of improve, be more transparent in operations with respect to emissions, with respect to material sourcing, the type of labor used, et cetera. That is driving the need for a sort of network technology that can help you prove claims about a wide value chain that you couldn't before. But we heard a funny quote at a conference recently that was, let me say there was some sort of defense aspects to it in the US. And the quote was something like, someone had asked, can you tell me what our commodity exposure to Ukraine is? And let's say this request was back in March, and someone said, yeah, we'll get right on it. And then they turned around and said, we have no idea because we don't really know where stuff comes from. And so it's kind of been highlighted by the current geopolitical context and all the supply chain disruptions, et cetera. I think this change is coming, right? So there's just going to be a whole lot more visibility, transparency, et cetera. It'll be kind of table stakes in the future. And I would say at a meta level, this is our driving use case. People want to know more about what they're buying, and it could be anything from complex equipment to food to to chemicals to any sort of industrial product. Simply because consumer preferences are changing, and there's a lot more pressure on companies to be sort of good citizens, if you will. And so that's been again one of the big driving use cases in the last couple of years.
And with that sort of, I guess, if you had this widespread adoption with where you did have all of this reporting information about companies as well as data around supply chains, do you think there'd be support there for that to be public knowledge? Say for publicly listed companies anyway, they have certain fiduciary duties that they need to do. Do you feel like it could get to that point there, or it's likely that corporates are likely to want to protect that, partly to maintain competitive advantage and so on, see who they don't necessarily want to disclose who all the different suppliers are that they're using for the manufacture of certain products?
It's always a delicate question. And also, just for us as well, like in some of our projects, we're being asked to compute our own carbon footprint, for instance. And then if you look at how to do that, it's like, okay, so we need to know headcount and where is everyone? Are they in an office? Not. We can look at our vendors and all that sort of thing. And we're like, if I give out this calculation, some of the information is sensitive, right? So, we've experienced this ourselves. I think what you'll see is the blockchain will be used at a sort of final reporting level. It'll be public, especially for public trading companies. So I think the EU is a little bit ahead in the sense of the US as far as requiring those disclosures and you to be audited on your carbon footprint and all that sort of thing. The US seems to be getting there. I think the SEC made an announcement a month or two ago. I don't know if it's been ratified yet, but basically they're going to require quite a bit more disclosure even around like your scope 3 emissions, which gets to your whole vendor list than before for big companies. So I think it's trending that way as well. And so I guess my thought on that is they'll disclose as much as they need to and not more. But I think what the technology will help them do is do the calculation like I would describe. Like what is your carbon footprint? Do that privately, but make it auditable by a third party, and it could be much more automated than what someone would do today is analyze all of your line items in an ERP and a project management system that's tracking all the things you did, and then individually attribute a footprint to each, add it all up in a big spreadsheet, et cetera. It's labor intensive, difficult to track, error prone, right? What we'll have is, and what we do have is sort of a list of means to do the calculation. So you'll just be more like, arranging templates for activities. A number will come out at the end. The ability to assign the footprint in a complex value chain is important and a good benefit of blockchain technology. Simply that it's quite often we're dealing with a supply chain setting basically, and then you're adding data that didn't used to be there to the commercial process. So instead of just purchase orders, invoices, shipments, etc., you're capturing footprint. What was done at a farm, for instance, what kind of practices were employed, actual IoT data, that sort of thing, and that sort of travels with the physical object, if that makes sense, in a digital representation. On the blockchain, that data shouldn't really be public for everyone to see. Like you don't want the whole world to know like where all the inventory is just for reasons of like theft. You do probably need to be able to prove that to someone. So prove it to an auditor, prove it to a regulator, all that sort of thing, and have some amount of public disclosure at the end, which is supported by all of that data, but not necessarily revealing that data to the whole world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you're kind of going to have almost clusters of information shared on different blockchains. We all know there's not going to be one singular chain out there, but there'll be in effect information that's relevant to specific parties, they'll be able to disclose that easily enough, and it's almost the need to know basis type scenario.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I think that is definitely still the preferred working model. And I don't really see that changing. I think it's going to get more and more convenient. It will feel like our system feels like you've got a singular chain that everyone's on, um, and all of the data is there, but for the fact that you don't actually have to share it with everybody. So it's very convenient once you choose to share the data with other parties, and you have the same level of authentication of the um, security, quality, origin of the data. But yeah, you don't actually have to disclose proprietary business details to everybody under the sun. So that's kind of the key point. And yes, need to know is a good way to say it. I think it's just going to stay that way, unless, yeah. And I can't imagine it would be totally untenable to say to companies, like from a legal or regulatory perspective, like you got to disclose everything you're doing. They just, there would be no support for such a thing. So I think that's one of the big areas where, and we've talked about it a bunch on this call and in the past, but that's one of the big areas where the people who are working in public blockchains are working on really technical solutions to this problem to some extent, but are not thinking about like how the business people think and feel about this problem. It's got to be both secure but convenient. And my sense for technologies like your heavier zero knowledge proofs, Starks, etc., they're not at the level of convenient yet. And you got to imagine like a business user interfacing with your privacy paradigm, and so I think there's a disconnect there that we're uniquely in a position to solve.
So to touch more on the public networks and how they fit into this, I know right now you kind of have these thriving ecosystems that are being built on them. A lot of experimentation, be that in terms of the digital assets that they host, but also the communities that they host as well. Do you see that? Where do you see its relationship to enterprise potentially in the coming years, and how it might evolve long term?
Good question. So I think that, for one, at least semi-public enterprise layer ones, they exist to date, um, will happen. I think the most important thing is that the enterprises can protect their data. I think it's not that important that they get standalone networks in most cases. Now, sometimes you've got a use case where banks are actually have their own like telecommunications infrastructure in some countries, and like that's a case where they might need a standalone permission network. Government, certain use cases where they're just legally required to be on premise, and they also have their own communication networks. I think they get their own network too. But for the majority, right, I think everyone uses the internet, right, and this means like when you email people, the sensitive commercial data in your email goes through lots of other servers. So as long as you, and in theory could end up in the hands of your competitor, et cetera, it's hidden from view, it's secure. And so people are not so worried about that. But with blockchains, there's still this perception that it's got to be really standalone. I need my network. I think that will blur a little bit, and that so long as the technology wraps the complexity and is secure, that you will see something like a convergence between the public permission side, or the public side, and the private permission side. At least enterprises also need to benefit from the network effect. I think we didn't exactly talk much about it, but the pseudonymity tends not to work for them, simply because you must know who the counterparty is that you're doing business with. You need recourse to the legal system. And so you'll see, and I don't know philosophically that the public blockchain people will kind of come to grips with that. Like I think there are ways to design public or quasi-public blockchains that do not have pseudonymity, but I think most of the people in the space have the attitude that you don't want to enforce that at a lower level. Like people can choose to disclose who they are if they want, but it's just sort of butting heads with the way most of the world works today. So so I don't know if some of those major aspects will get solved so that enterprises can really use public networks at scale. they may be used for authentication's sake. You see a lot of the times a pattern where something happens on a layer 2 and data in some form is posted back to a layer 1. Maybe we will see that pattern. But I think I certainly think some of the public blockchain technologies could be adapted to be sort of enterprise consumable, enterprise ready. But the people involved don't seem to know what that means from the uh, having the dealing with the painful aspects of enterprise one, sales cycles and all that sort of thing, integration with what they're doing today, etc. Dealing with the legal KYC aspects, etc. I think there's just philosophically on two different paths, and that I don't know. It's possible that the public blockchain path will just technologically solve all the problems, and that one day we'll wake up and it's enterprise ready. But my gut is that you have to go in that direction specifically. So again, I think you will see convergence in some form. We watch what's going on in the public blockchain world, try to incorporate these sort of best of breed enterprise, applicable enterprise ready features. But yeah, the really painful stuff dealing with the enterprise, maybe that will happen in the public blockchain world. I think people are also just too distracted by the speculative asset value there to take on something that's difficult, takes a long time, and does not necessarily lead to a digital native asset exploding in value, let's say. So we will see. And I'm interested in your opinion as well. I guess you're interviewing me, but
Yeah. No, I think the last point you make there as well about the types of assets that have really exploded because of the financial sort of speculation side, where one of the areas that we speak a bit about internally is the whole decentralized identity or self-sovereign identities and all of those technologies, because they have so much applicability for enterprise, but it doesn't feel like that space is moving anything like as quickly, because there's not like a nice easy, yes, there are companies creating tokens around it, but it's something that's enterprises are the big beneficiaries typically of that, and so it just moves at a different rate. So it is funny in that respect. I certainly think in terms of this statement a friend of mine made, which was, when you get to that point of having the equivalent of a VPN on the internet existing on blockchain, so you can completely deal in a private way. The encryption technologies get to a point where things can be done in a fully secure way on chain, then that could certainly be game changing. But there is the attraction of the public networks in that they are kind of like a utility. And I wanted to revisit what you were talking about earlier with respect to the governance and blockchain structure, because certainly in some respects, we've seen some enterprise blockchains just not fulfill their potential because they've got kind of stuck in governance or legal related issues. And so given all of this success that BlockApps has had with respect to the network launches, I'd love to understand just a little bit more about how you get governance right for these sorts of things. And you mentioned that there are companies and also parts of companies that have much better awareness of how to do this now than they did a number of years ago. But I'm sure there's going to be people listening who would love to get some pointers and what's the best way to do this stuff.
Yeah, great question. So I certainly do not have the final answer. I would say it's improved a lot. It's still really tough, right? So I think what people need to think about is where there's shared interest to kind of invest in some form in a shared system. So often that investment does actually come in the form of like standing up a company, joint venture, and all that sort of thing. It's very labor intensive. There's a lot of legal, a lot of negotiation, a lot of back and forth. And I would caution the enterprises out there to not, if they do that, not like strangle the thing too much. Basically my experience of big businesses is they're very kind of control focused. And to some extent that can limit the benefit that they get from the technology. So, having like really prescribed roadmap, long-term, phases, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, et cetera. There needs to be a mix of top-down planning, but also just an agility to react to the needs of the the end users who are, if it's a consortium, are often the investors as well. I think the tech attitude is to, invest a little bit ahead of the market, build a technology, and then keep iterating on it. And typically, the big traditional business attitude is to sort of wait till things are ready. Um, Long planning cycles, very deliberate, step by step sort of thing. And blockchains are still new enough that you kind of have to work in the first mode, at least to some extent, and just focus on what's going to get adoption. But I think there's also, again, there's a lot of value in having a group of players that are incentivized to grow something, right? I think I mean big businesses, they don't want to bring on new mission critical software that repeats the cycle that they've had with the, I'll call them by name, but don't get mad at me. These big companies, the Oracles, the SAPs, to some extent the Microsofts, who a little bit are, it's so critical that they're a little bit holding the customers over the barrel sometimes. And you're hearing about 8-figure upgrades to the next SAP version, or even 9-figure. And they in a downturn in some sectors, people will get rid of a lot of employees before they get rid of the ERP. Right, the ERP is just totally essential. So if I think there's a real benefit to the idea that the mission critical software that you as an enterprise use in the future, that you install now, you have some level of ownership interest in, and some level of governance over. So it's a delicate balance. You want the upside from the success of a software company, right? So the enterprises are not really home growing software and selling it to each other, or all that sort of thing. That's just for commercial reasons, and also just the ability to execute. That's not really happening. There's more success in consortium type settings, and that all said, I think the idea that Web3 is about. Yeah, you probably read the Andreessen Horowitz kind of state of crypto report, came out like a week or two ago. It's very interesting in that crypto generally, blockchains generally, can be viewed as sort of really an ownership platform, where instead of Facebook monetizing 100% of something you create, or the App Store taking 30%, you keep nearly all of it, right? And so I think the enterprises themselves, who have also always had a lot of homegrown software, will start to get the idea that if they can figure it out, they can solve problems as an industry. They can use blockchain technology to do it, and they can be a little bit less exposed to vendor predation, if you will, in doing so with the technology. That said, they have to still align with the right mindset. You sort of have to pick problems again where there's something of a shared interest. You can certainly create proprietary advantage and value add on blockchain technology, but you sort of have to have the infrastructure in place for that first, and that often comes from a problem with the shared interest. You see a lot of them in trading settings, so anything from supply chain to commodity trading of some kind, or bank-to-bank payment systems, et cetera. They have to do business with each other already. So putting in a system to track, administer, execute that better sort of makes sense, where for use cases that are really internal, it makes less sense. So it's a delicate balance, really. So you need to set up a structure again, so where the blockchain is somewhat neutral. It needs to generate revenue in a sense, so that there are people who are there to stand it up, maintain it, run the infrastructure. If there are apps on top of it, keep developing those apps, etc. But you also want, as an enterprise, a little more control over it than you had over, like I said, your big enterprise software and SaaS vendors of old. So it's threading the needle between all of these is the big challenge, but we've seen that it's improved significantly in the last few years, from the funding side, from just the understanding of the cycle, and from the adoption side.
Yeah, it's interesting around the revenue generation point as well. So I guess if you have that nice alignment with the different participants about here's a revenue model that works, then I'm sure they're going to scramble towards it. But no doubt that also takes has taken quite a bit of education over the years, because of how really it's more about the on and off ramps to the platforms, and then the assets that exist on those platforms that are kind of where the revenue opportunities are, rather than the classic I know just where they have like an API where they charge for usage. Is kind of that more, it's slightly more nuanced on these platforms to really do the stuff properly.
Yeah, it's been a mix. I mean, I think in many cases, and for us, like a subscription model is still applicable. There's ongoing effort to keep the network up, to maintain software and all that sort of thing. So it makes sense that there are ongoing fees. It's more challenging, to your point, with public networks where everything is sort of one time. And so there has to be continual volume and maybe transaction fees or something of this nature to keep funding a company to do all of this. Now, at the moment, the asset values are still probably keeping everyone afloat. But if we saw a big crash, then suddenly people are asking like where are we gonna find the developers, or if people need to with some. It's been interesting to segue just slightly. Crypto seems to be behaving more like a high beta tech stock than an inflation hedge, or a place where people fly to safety when things go bad, right? And it seems to be when things are going bad, at least right now, both the stock market and crypto fall. I don't know why. I think it's more correlation now than you've seen in the past. I don't know exactly what's causing that, but with a reasonable chance of recession, or lots of people are saying this anyway, you'll wonder sort of. And there's still a ton of venture capital supporting crypto, but I assume that will tighten. They'll just deploy less of it, or concentrate it in the winners. You think you'll see some consolidation coming, and so the public blockchain model makes it sort of fairly hard to predict what like future ongoing revenues will be, especially as wildly variable fees, fluctuating prices, and all that sort of thing. So. It's an important question to tackle, especially on the enterprise side. They want fairly long-term certainty, and so not having to contend with the asset value fluctuations makes a big difference. So I mean, there's just been a whole host of models deployed for how to charge for these things. And to your point, I think the key is to get everyone to accept the model and to make sure there's enough upside, both to cover costs and have returns for investors who might be like the end users themselves, might be financially motivated investors, but also some downside protection too, right? So it's an interesting point you make.
So there's been a number of different big launches that have been announced over the years. In terms of the most recent platform, I believe network that you launched was the Trace Carbon network, but then also there's been ones covering quite a diverse range of areas across different industries, such as seismic entitlement, beef transparency on supply chain, campaign finances, tracing harvests, and also energy usage. And I think it really speaks to just the diversity of the different places where you see these opportunities. But are there any industries which you feel that you've got in your sights which you haven't been able to kind of get into yet, which you feel really need to embrace this?
I'll give you maybe a nuanced answer. So we've actually, as a company, been focused on things that happen to some extent physically, and in the physical, tangible world. And this has been challenging, right? Like the purely digital native assets sort of trade easily. There are standards for them, and it's easy to effectuate transfer, right? Physical assets, you can have sort of a title of the physical asset and a tracking capability on the blockchain. And there's maybe there's shipments, there's purchase orders, et cetera. But then someone actually has to move the thing in the real world. And so that's true of all tracking systems to date. It's not a blockchain specific problem, but it's been challenging in particular, and it's been a benefit to us that we've developed technology to work well with physical real world assets. So that's been our focus. So to your point, we have a lot of concentration of customers in agribusiness, concentration of customers in the energy sector, lots of kind of operational supply chain, then we have a fair number of startups, as well. An area that we're starting to do more work in is financial services, and so we've purposefully avoided financial services for some time. Basically because it was, especially in the early days, extremely competitive. Everyone wanted to, be the one to kill Visa, be the one to stand up the new bank-to-bank payment infrastructure, et cetera. And there were some successes there for sure. But, I think it was just oversaturated with blockchain vendors. And so dealing with the tough physical stuff, different sorts of, companies, was really helpful for us, and continues to be really our bread and butter. That said, we're starting to see use cases where you have to tie the two together. So we're in the we're sort of in the carbon offset tracking marketplace sort of space, at this time. And what we're seeing is that there's a big gap in terms of demand for carbon offsets, and then basically project financing to execute on projects that tend to be fairly capital intensive. So again, we're not in the fairly low cost, high margin software world. We're talking about people doing, creating biofuels, changing fairly heavy recycling processes so they are, lower carbon intensity. You're talking about stuff with real, capital commitment tied to it, slower moving than software in some ways. And so the companies that are used to funding these things are, in some cases, big corporates themselves, like the energy companies who do really large, capital-intensive physical projects, to a lesser extent, there's not like a really mature like VC type market for these sorts of projects. So there's an example where it's not just about tracking the carbon offset. Of course it is, but to really make the market work, you need either debt or equity investment capabilities to get enough of the supply of these projects off the ground, where really big companies could afford to fund a project that, say, maybe it's for cogeneration of energy that they need the energy anyway, and they can claim a carbon offset at the out of it as an output of that product. Smaller companies just have to buy the carbon offsets, and so the price of them varies. And it's funny, you hear the phrase high quality carbon offsets a lot in the space, which they should be just carbon offsets, right? It's just a number at the end of the day, but it's true, right? They're not fungible. Like, you have to look at the underlying project to see whether the carbon offset is real, legitimate, in the eyes of auditors, regulators, the public, et cetera, and also has not been doubly consumed. So there's a whole lot of bringing down the barrier to entry that needs to happen, that comes with a mature sort of credit market. We also see use cases, receivables, and of course it's supply chain related, or a popular use case for us, where basically people are managing complex projects or deliveries, et cetera, and there's just a data mismatch between what one of their accounting systems says and what the other says, and it tends to create payment delays. Also, just intransparency in what milestones have been achieved on projects as well. And there we're dealing with the real world business process first, but there's also the opportunity to, a lot of industries run on factoring. Factoring basically is, if you've got a purchase order, if you got an invoice, often in effect, a lender, sometimes they're not banks, sometimes they are banks, will advance you most of the value of these, and say 80% of the value of the invoice, and that will allow you to deliver, manufacturing the goods that the customer needs, let's say. And then when you do the delivery, you get the rest, and there's like an effective interest rate of maybe 2% per month, which is pretty significant. If you knew more about the physical delivery, the project, the manufacturing effort, et cetera, as a lender, you might be willing to lower the effective interest rate because the risk is lower. And so, again, that's an example where you've got something happening in the physical world, but there's a credit market that's supporting it, that having more data about that process could help you make more efficient, if that makes sense. So this is a new direction for us that we're just moving into in the last 6 to 12 months, but it's starting to pick up some steam.
And it certainly seems like it's a nice kind of segue into it as well, with respect to the big push for ESG related reporting and so on. And as you said earlier, that with companies, it's gone from, what is it, 20% up to like 90% of, was it the S&P that yeah, and our
We did the
reporting.
report. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's right.
yeah. Um, so in terms of yeah, I guess looking forward, sort of 10 years into the future, do you think that there'll be some, very fundamental changes in terms of how these different networks operate? Because I see from our conversation, you've got all these different this multi-blockchain future where they're kind of servicing different niches or industries. Do you think it's just going to become more commonplace, or are there going to be some bigger changes, you think, in a slightly longer time horizon?
It's a good question. So a couple things I think will happen. One, it will start to feel more like one, even if it's multiple. We, in particular, are not. Um, it's customer need that drives us to have multiple or perceived customer need. Like I think, to your point, the VPN is a good analogy. In the long run, it's going to feel like you have your own blockchain. They're going to interoperate. The important ones will interoperate better than they do today. Um, and but in the end, it'll be like a meta network, right? So like there is sort of one internet, which is composed of lots of different sub internets. Something like that will happen with the technology. So I also think we're still at the early stages of it, but you're going to see a lot of kind of rubber meeting the road on real assets being represented within blockchains. So there's some nice articles about there that show that blockchain sort of market cap value is like 3 trillion, and real assets are 5 or 800 trillion or something like that. The bigger use case is taking everything that's happening in the world today and getting it into the blockchain versus creating amazing, don't get me wrong, but net new blockchain native digital assets that just wouldn't have existed 10 years ago. So I think, and this is a trend we're betting on, I think we're going to see the world go more in that direction, where it's like the internet starts to get tightly integrated into daily life, and you're less aware that you're using it, that sort of thing. It's still a technical, hobbyist, and to some extent speculators technology right now. And of course, big companies who have R&D budgets and all that sort of thing. It's going to be more omnipresent, more links to physical reality, and less obtrusive in some ways over the next 10 years. So that's kind of what we're betting on.
Oh, awesome to hear that. And yeah, finally, just to wrap up, if people want to learn more about Strato and Block Apps, and or also learn more, interact with you, are there any specific platforms that you're active in?
Yeah, so website's blockapps.net. We have a fair amount of content there. I'm reasonably active on LinkedIn as well, so you can find me on LinkedIn. And we're often doing podcasts like this, so we usually post them on our website on LinkedIn and Twitter, I suppose, as well. But LinkedIn is probably the best.
Awesome. Well, Kieran, it's been an absolute pleasure hosting you, and I look forward to another future conversation at some point.
Yep, I'm sure we'll have one, reasonably soon. These are always fun, so appreciate being asked back, and we'll keep marking it as it progresses in the next few years. It's been interesting times for sure, good times, but interesting times. So.
Absolutely. All right, see you
Thanks
soon.
again.
Cheers. Hi, it's Connor Svensson here again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm really excited to share with you that I've written a book, The Blockchain Innovator's Handbook, a leader's guide to understanding, adopting and succeeding with this disruptive technology. I've been wanting to share my learnings about blockchain and Web3 for a number of years with a wider audience, and I'm really excited that I can do this now. This book covers everything from the fundamentals of the technology through to opportunity identification and implementation for your business to ensure that you can be one of the big beneficiaries of the wider transition to Web3 that's taking place now. The book is available in physical as well as digital form. For more information, head to web3labs.com/innovators.